Hi, Dr. Morton.
I'm in here.
Can you see us?
Sorry?
You can see us?
I can, or I can see you and about six others.
Yeah, I'll sort
Yes,
of, I'll try and,
so that's there.
oh, very good. Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule. And we just have a few questions for you, and hopefully you can sort of shed some light on a few things for us. I guess one of the things, though, before we start is to sort of tell us sort of your relationship with the school first, and then how did you sort of come to SJR, and where did you go from there, and how are you at McGill right now as sort of a retired professor?
Well, my dad was transferred from Regina to Winnipeg, and he decided that he'd been to a private school, Upper Canada, and I should go to one. And Ravens course, as it's called then, was it. So I got on the bus and came out. And it was an interesting experience in a lot of ways, not all of it positive. Then we had the Great Winnipeg Flood, or what I thought was the Great Winnipeg Flood. The school was forced to close. We all flew to Saskatoon and spent the last 2 months of the academic year at the University of Saskatchewan. I found very interesting because we were in the crop husbandry building, and we could see alternate posters about how crops work. I never know it before. Not for science, very important. Anyway, when school had been amalgamated with St. John's School, another boys' private school by Anglican Church, which had fallen on hard times. So we took on some of the staff and some of the students, very few really, advocate St. John's Ravens for us, as I think we still are. It was a boys' school then, I understand it's co-ed now.
Yep.
Probably greatly advantaged by that, but he didn't have that pleasure or privilege. When I finished the year, my dad had been transferred yet again to Kingston this time. We ended up in Japan. And so I graduated actually from an institution called the Canadian Academy in Kobe, Japan. We weren't allowed to have Japanese students. Japanese law forbade it. So I didn't learn much Japanese, but I did learn French because our teacher only spoke French. And that's a marvelous way to learn the language. Particularly when you've had a bit in Ontario and you think you know it, suddenly discover you don't, but you learn a lot fast. Anyway, I came back to Canada, went to the University of Royal Saint-Jean, which is a French-speaking military college.
Mm-hmm.
Got through that, enjoyed it, in fact, far better than my father feared it would be, because he had been to RFC and suffered the terrible bullying and abuse that went on in those days.
Sure.
We had none of that at CFR. So I had a brief career in the Army, a little longer than I wanted because I got a Rhodes Scholarship when I went to RSC, and that forced me 2 more years. When I got out, I went to work in politics for a couple of years. Probably the most interesting job I've ever had in my life. I've never worked harder or enjoyed it more. But in the end, I thought I better do something about this, so I applied for the third year of the Rhodes, which I did as a PhD student at the London School of Economics. So I came back to Canada with a PhD and a job, because during my political career I made contacts, of course, at the University of Ottawa at a leave vacancy for 1 year. So I took that and looked around. Managed to publish my first book, and that's great help to people to do it. And I ended up at the University of Toronto, not downtown. I wasn't quite good enough for that, but I could go to the suburban campus, Toronto, which was, again, a great privilege because I watched it grow. And that's for historic experience. You see what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And I got very involved and became, in the end, principal of the University of Toronto's campus. From that, I served 7 years. I recommend 7 years as the maximum for anybody who wants to do a job like that, because if you haven't done it for 7 years, you're either not going to do it or you'll do it very bad. Or maybe it shouldn't be done. So I came, there's an invitation from McGill was to help create the Institute of Study in Canada. I went the wrong way up the Highway 401 to Quebec. At that time, everybody was leaving, terrified of stopping them with. I had no intention of letting them. I was going to work as hard as I could to prevent it. And here at McGill, I had that opportunity. So here I worked until I retired at the age of 70. I'm talking about 68 in my life. And I've been working harder than ever since, including teaching a course and having the privilege of being among you.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we've been really excited about it. What I guess I'll start off with the questions.
Sure that now.
One of the questions that I think we'll start with, if that's okay, and then the students will ask you a few questions here and there. Is we've been looking at sort of the time period post Manitoba coming into Confederation, post Red River Rebellion. We call it a rebellion, or a resistance. Sorry, we call it a resistance out here. And we've been sort of looking at the time of Laurier, and we've been looking at sort of significant events in there. And I'm wondering if you might comment on what, if you think, or how that end of the 19th century has played out in the 20th century and the 21st century.
Well, we survived it. I will say, I've been thinking about the questions you sent to me, that MacDonald's decision to have Riel executed in 1885, and it really was his decision, was probably the worst decision he made in a career of making pretty good decisions on the whole. Was my view. Lord knows I've spent a long time in the paper. I think he was insane. He was well qualified to be in a insane asylum. He was not really aware of what he was doing. He was having trances and religious experiences that even his colleagues, the basic community, thought were insane. But he had suffered the experience of being in an insane asylum here in Quebec, Beaufort Asylum, which later was investigated and found to be a scandal of scandals. Misappropriation of funds, terrible treatment of the inmates, and on and on. Well, Riel never wanted to go anywhere near an insane asylum, and although his lawyers in the trial came from Quebec, knew that only an insanity plea could save his life, he managed to undermine their case by giving a pretty clear explanation of why he'd done things. It was incoherent, it was disorganized, but it was not the work of a madman. And so in the end, he was executed, as you know, and he became marked to Quebec that might, in MacDonald's view, have dismissed him as a criminal or as somebody who would attack the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church even came around to Riel in the end, forgiving him for what he had done. He locked up most of the priests of Batoche in their own house, threatened to kill them. Other priests had been killed during the uprising of Native people. But the church swallowed all that because they recognized how strong public opinion was in Quebec. It was wrong to execute a man like that. The English, of course, were screaming for his scalp. So, as usual in Canada, more of the trouble is caused by the English-speaking majority than by the Franco minority. If Riel had been sent to a Manitoba insane asylum, which there was one in those days, he would have had a pretty miserable life, but he would not have been executed. He would still have been alive and could have, managed. It was a big mistake.
Right. Does anybody have a question that they want to pitch right now? One of the questions that I have, we've been looking at Laurier quite a bit, and he sort of came into a time of sort of an economic boom, and a lot of people sort of see him as a nation builder, similar to Macdonald. I mean, different from Macdonald, but still a nation builder. Do you think, was that more of luck of just happening to come in during an economic boom, or did he have some skill, political skill?
I think he had very considerable skill. He also had the quality that Napoleon demanded of his general. He was liked. Because nobody could have said, that wasn't that much money now, but of course the economy was enormously smaller in those days. And the effect of having a sudden supply of gold to buy your way out of the debts that he'd inherited from the conservatives tradition of this country allowed him to discover gentlemen. He was also somebody who did understand Quebec, and that's pretty much an essential for any Prime Minister candidate to succeed. And it worries me enormously today. We've never had a Prime Minister with less support in Quebec than the one we have now, because it robs us of information, of contacts, experience. When you grow up in a town like Burlington, Lord knows I live not far away from it, you do not learn much about Quebec. Don't learn the language, although you become reasonably proficient in it, but above all, you don't understand it. Over the last couple of days, for example, this is a very modern thing, he's closed down funding for the homeless, an organization that arranged housing for the homeless without people who were on the street. They have the faintest idea why this is done. And it's a very popular charity in Montreal. Why has the government cut it off? Instead, it's given several $1 million to a magazine that runs pictures of half-naked women, which may be fine for them, but it's not exactly what French Canadians thought the federal government should support. They do believe in supporting their culture, and this doesn't do it. Not in any way that most Quebecers ever conceive. I don't blame Mr. Harper for being this way. I just think it's a consequence of having a Prime Minister who simply doesn't understand this country and will therefore do much damage to it. I don't think Quebec will separate, but it will come very close, much closer to it than it would have under a leader who tried hard to understand.
Moving away from Laurier just a little bit. I'm sorry that I'm sort of scattered all over the place.
Oh, that's fine. So is history. All over the place.
I mean, treaties 1 to 6. We've looked at treaties 1 and 2 quite extensively, but treaties 1 through 6 have sort of a big role in the development of Manitoba and then the Northwest. And it seemed that, and we've had some Indigenous folks talk to us about it, that the treaties weren't necessarily a bad thing for First Nations. But the Indian Act did something, and I'm wondering what you think sort of that the Indian Act did to those treaties and did to the relationship that Canada had with the various First Nations, particularly in Western Canada.
Well, of course, it hadn't had a relationship with those people. It had a relationship with Eastern Native people, not a very close or intense one, incidentally. We're looking at the War of 1812, and I've just sent off an article explaining the people who stayed in Canada from the Americans were the Native people. And they did the fighting, much of it in the early days. So did French Canadians. You'll never read that in an Ontario school textbook. I doubt you will in Manitoba.
Probably not.
Bothered about the War of 1812. It's not in their time. But the Native people, there are a lot of problems with the Indian Act. There are a lot of problems with the treaties. How did the people who signed those treaties, or put their marks on them, understand them? And it's pretty clear that they didn't understand, nor were they well interpreted. You needed lawyers and lawyer language to understand. The Indian Act was there to provide the services that were apparently promised. Well, is a medicine chest the equivalent of full-scale, modern healthcare management? But obviously not. A few dried-out pills and a rusty scalpel is not exactly modern medicine. Nor was education provided by the churches. Free. Imagine the finance minister when he discovered that now this wouldn't cost Canada a penny. It would be all paid for by the churches. No further questions, not allowed. So the Indian Act, it reflects both the weaknesses of the Canadian government and its fiscal conservatism of it, but also the interpretation and understanding of that act and of the treaties that underlay it. Because I don't think Native people really could understand that language from their own experience.
Yeah.
That's been a case made to be by First Nations people here in McGill and across the country. But how do you change that now?
Well, and that
There's one change recommended, and that is, Professor Flanagan at Calgary recommends essentially privatization. Let the native people own their own homes, their own land, then they can prosper. Why would you fix a house you didn't own? Well, that's very clever. Look how well it worked in the United States. In the 1870s and 80s, there was a vast movement of privatization at a time when people were flooding into the American West to settle. The settlers bought the Indian land. They sold out very quickly because they were poor and in debt, and they moved into cities where, because they couldn't earn a living, because they had none of the work skills needed, or any of the experience of living in that environment or surviving experience, they died.
yeah.
That solved the Indian problem for the Americans. Not in any way we would be proud to claim Canadians. That's where we could learn from their history.
Sure. One of the questions that one of the students had the other day, we had one group looking at the CPR scandal, and they actually went out into Winnipeg and asked Winnipeggers what they knew about the CPR scandal. But somebody, and I don't know if it's William, somebody said, hey, Mr. Henderson, why is it that with the F-35 scandal and different things like that, do we sort of nowadays go, oh, well, that's just the government doing something dubious, whereas, say, in the 19th century or even with conscription with Borden, there seemed to be, with scandals or controversial issues, a greater public reaction. Do you have any sort of historical insight on that, or are we just reaching here?
Well, I spent some time reading Richard Gwynn's book on McDonald, and I began to get another view of the Pacific scandal. For one thing, it went on and on for years. And there were Canadians, who the Prime Minister, who by and large they trusted to be a good manager of the country, but who was accused in all sorts of documents of collecting money for his election. Well, the question I've always asked my classes, which I'd ask your students, how should we be paying for people to run for election in a democracy? Should the people have to raise money? The people who give them the money will expect a return. Sir Hugh Allen, who was the richest man in Canada, but by no means rich enough for his own greed, was willing to sell out the Canadian Pacific Railway to the promoters of the Northern Pacific Railway, which runs along the north. If it was built, we didn't need a CPR. The Americans would control the railway traffic. Well, this was part of the Pacific scandal. Allen was broke, in my view. Certainly, he lied vigorously in public. Of course, he was a very wealthy man. Who wants to criticize him? But he was also paying for the Conservative Party to get elected because he thought he had to buy the throne. The Liberal Party bribes clerks in various offices of people associated with the scandal to steal the documents in those offices. That was, in fact, is a bit of a scandal, but there they are allegedly trying to find one. Is it for the benefit of the purity of the government? The advancement of the Liberal Party. Isn't that corrupt? I'm not sure. But it is a long story, which few people understand. Now, the F-35 is an interesting comparison. I happened to read a magazine from the United States called Defense News. It's been running the problems of the F-35 for years, about 10 years. Does nobody in Ottawa actually read that magazine? I'm told that the Minister of National Defense is no brainiac, but does anybody in his office read the official periodical of the defense and military production industry in the United States? I'd be very astonished if they did. But if you did, you'd know about the F-35. There are no mysteries there. It has been built on a non-competitive basis because that's the way George Bush, the previous Republican president, thought he could save a lot of money. It hasn't saved him any money. It's gone over and over and over its budget because it wants to be the best aircraft in the world. And getting the equipment for it is a matter of reading today's paper and finding out what they've just discovered in technology. Well, is that what we really want for an airplane, for our airport? The best in the world? You bet. Or do we need it? Who are we going to use to, who are we going to attack with the RF-35? Nobody we know. So it's a problem. But I think, again, it's a problem of information, the reluctance of voters to get into these complicated issues, and a wish to let somebody else worry about it. Well, it's our country. In a democracy, you should take responsibility for these things. And if your government won't take responsibility, find one that will. And there are lots of choices.
Yeah. Okay. Did anybody have a question? William has a question.
Thank you.
Where was it? Do you think Quebec should separate from Canada? And what do you think are the main wedges between Quebec and Canada historically?
I think if Quebec leaves Canada, I'm sitting here in the middle of Quebec, I shall be extremely disappointed. I will not be as surprised as I might have been. I understand where Michael Ignatieff was coming from, not to become a separatist, and I'm not who I wish he would, but to explain that if you don't understand Quebec, you got to get some people around you who do. And he saw in the present government an enormous weakness in that respect. I see it too. And it disturbs me because in casual actions, based on ignorance, they do stupid things, which annoy Quebec. Not anything like executing a person. Most Quebecers think it's innocent, in case of the else, but small, stupid things that annoy groups of people. They're quite unnecessary. They don't save the Canadian taxpayer any money at all. And if Canada breaks up, let me tell you, Quebec will not be the only province to leave. It will start a process of breakup. We've seen that in Serbia, former Yugoslavia. We've seen it in Central Asia with the former Russian Republic. It will be a process we will all regret. We will come back and live in diminished Canada. All because our side wouldn't listen to anyone else. That's pretty stupid. And I think we've got to get over it.
Yeah. One of the questions that sort of comes up every year is the relationship between Canada and Great Britain. And everybody sort of says, the standard answer is Vimy was sort of the start of this, sort of cutting ties, and then the Citizenship Act and all this. But were there certain events at the end of the 19th century that started? I mean, 1871, I know they did pull sort of garrisons out, but were there other events, political or military or social events, that helped create or start to cut those ties?
I think they come later because during the First World War, Canadians, English-speaking Canadians, were tremendously strong on supporting England and the Empire. It cost us 67,000 young people as soldiers. We went bankrupt as a country because we decided to finance that war on credit, not on taxes. And we broke up the country because we introduced conscription. Louis Riel fades in significance compared to imposing conscription on people who didn't feel any loyalty to Britain whatsoever, and no loyalty to Quebec to France either. France was the business of dispossessing the Roman Catholic Church, and a community that was deeply devoutly concerned with the Catholic Church was not going to find much interest in saving France from a disaster it had brought on itself. Mm-hmm. That's the reality of the politics. But you couldn't say that in Toronto. In fact, you couldn't say it in British Columbia. There was British Columbia. It's an interesting story to me, at least, from you, the history teacher. BC began to teach Canadian history after the Second World War. And they commissioned a guy named Monty Grant, who was the headmaster of Upper Canada College, and who had lost a leg in the war, to write that history. Monty Grant was a fair-minded person, and he explained at some length why Quebec had opposed conscription. When that book was distributed in British Columbia, there was a furious outcry. How dare you tell our students that? The book was literally burned, and it had to be hurriedly withdrawn, and somebody else got to produce it. Monty was telling them the truth. They couldn't stand it. Not the parents, anyway. The kids were never asked. Of course, they never are. But that story tells you something about how Canada was tied to Great Britain and was constant. In the Second World War, we approached with the wisdom of hindsight. Mackenzie King promised a limited war. That's as much as possible while he delivered. But in the process, he also delivered prosperity that made Canadians almost forget about the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And which transformed us from a country of basically poor people, most of us couldn't afford to live without charity, to a country where by 1951, income figures proved that almost the great majority of Canadians passed into affluence. We become affluent society. By 1961, the income figures tell us that only 15% of Canadians were below the poverty line. I don't know what it is today, and neither does anyone else, because the government decided we wouldn't ask that question anymore. We'd asked it in 1911, 1921, 31, 41, 51, 61, 71, and so on, but we don't ask it anymore.
Right.
What embarrassment it might be to find out. But thanks to the Second World War for that, and perhaps thank you for the kids.
Right. And certainly, Dr. Alan Levine, who wrote the book about Mackenzie King, is my colleague here and teaches some of these guys as well. So, anybody have other questions?
Yeah.
Sasha?
1 second. Let me just find it. Oh, do you think the media adequately represents the views and concerns of society? Have they done so historically in Canada?
Oh, why would they? They're not in the media business to tell you all the things you need to know or to support sides that aren't popular. They're there to make money. If you're in the media business, you're there because you want to get rich. Look at Murdoch in London. He assumes the government is there to serve his purposes, and so it seems to be with both Labour and Conservative. He's a very powerful person, but he doesn't talk objectively about anything. He talks the way he feels. So let's be realistic about the media. And let's be realistic about free speech. Some people have free speech, and other people, nobody can hear them. There was a question about Tom Scott, why there isn't a Tom Scott museum or even a memorial. Tom Scott's big problem was not that he was an Orangeman. Nobody's ever been able to prove that. But that he was taken off by the Orange Lodge as a symbol, used as a symbol, and then thrown away. There was, in fact, a monument to Tom Scott in Winnipeg. I remember being taken to it. It was a house in the North End, which had been furnished in 1870s style, and it celebrated Tom Scott. But the Orange Lodge has ceased to exist, thank goodness, and I guess the house has probably been abandoned. The one monument to Tom Scott, build one yourself. It would be an interesting experience because his real role, in my view, was that he was Manitoba's first Labour hero. Because you know what he did? He came out with a road survey, with a survey gang, the boss of which, Mr. Stowe, decided he would not have to pay the workers. He pocketed their wages. One day, Scott approached him for his wages and was given a flat answer. He took Mr. Stowe by the collar and the pants and held him over the Red River, which was then in flood. Mr. Stowe decided maybe he would pay the workers, promised to do so. Instead, he scuttled off to town and found the local magistrate and had Scott arrested and imprisoned. Now, not that heroic, not that successful, but at least Scott had the courage to stand up to him. He also had the courage to stand up to Riel. But Riel had him seized, as with the leader of this rebellion for Canada, Major, I can't even remember his name, but he was Major Bolden. Major Bolden should be a hero of Manitoba because he opposed and put his life on the line to oppose Riel. But when Donald Smith discovered that Bolden was likely to be shot, he immediately claimed an interview with Riel and said, look, if you shoot Bolden, he's got friends. He's a very wealthy man. And the Boldens are a big family in Ontario. How'd you get rid of that little scumbag Scott? Nobody knows. And they all took good sense of that advice. And Scott paid for being a nothing. Scott paid for being a nobody. And Scott paid for being a troublemaker. He was executed by real.
Yeah. But getting back to the media, I mean, do you see a difference? Like when you look at sort of Confederation and pre-Confederation Globe and Mail with George Brown, I mean, there was sort of an open agenda there. Is it as open now? Like when I read the Globe and Mail, there's some leftists, there's some rightist writers, probably more to the left, but it doesn't seem to be as necessarily in your face in terms of its bias. Has that gradually changed, or are they both just this? Is it the same thing?
Well, I think it's more of the same thing. And when you look at a paper like the Toronto Star, which tends to be liberal, big L, particularly during elections, it can look a little NDP-ish between elections, but only as the election approaches, they get back on the side. That's a traditional partisan paper. And papers used to be more partisan because the parties paid for them. And they allowed them to have advertising from the government. They were heavily subsidized. But they were controlled by their editor and their publisher, their owner, as they still are. But owners have discovered that if you walk both sides of the street, you get more subscribers. If you don't have open politics, you can get more people watching or reading. So since the purpose of their business, so they make no bones about it, get richer, make money, pay the shareholders. So a business, the Winnipeg Free Press is not a public agency; it is a business. As long as you understand that, I think you're close to reality.
Right.
And it's not that new.
Question? Oh, William, one more question.
In your opinion, who was the best prime minister out of all the ones we had, and why?
Oh dear. Well, how do you judge a prime minister? And I've been faced with this exercise several times, particularly for Plains magazine. I say, how was Canada when it came into office? No GP, number one. And how was it when he or she left? And the best prime minister we ever had, I've mentioned his name, but yet in your curriculum, that's William Mackenzie King. When King came to office in 1921, Canada was in a heck of a mess. It was bankrupt, couldn't pay the veterans, it couldn't recover from the war. And gradually, over the years with King, until 1930, when he was displaced by Bennett, R.B. Bennett was there for the Great Depression. Fortunately, he was gone in 1935 and King returned to manage us through the Second World War. And I've said what contrast it made to the lives of ordinary Canadians. It was a great success. The Liberals were in power in the century, virtually one end to the other, because of the Liberals managing to be lucky and to make the country seem proper. And so I put down Mackenzie King. Nobody else faced because he was a truly difficult person. But he was a success. Was it his fault? Well, he was in charge. And if the captain gets you there, the captain gets you there. Sorry, dude. And he's nobody else's favorite, so you don't have to follow my advice except for results. And you should be governed by low results, as you will be, I'm sure, at the end of the year.
Question? Do you want? Yeah, you can go.
Okay, it's not from the list.
That's fine. No, it doesn't have to be.
So from what you know of Canadian history and like politics, what do you think of Canada's future? Does it look good to you or bad?
Well, this is where I live. I hope it looks good. As a historian, I understand a bit about the past. I understand nothing about the future because my head is screwed on wrong. I look back. So don't follow anybody whose head is screwed on so he's looking back. Look forward, see what you can, and don't pretend that you can see very much, and you'll do better. So I think I'm proud to be a Canadian. I'm not as proud as I once was. I don't like what's going on in Ottawa, obviously. but I am prepared to be proud again, and I think we have the way to achieve that. So stick with it.
I mean, that's an interesting.
We'll let you in anywhere else anyway. There.
An interesting follow-up to that is amongst students and my colleagues and friends, we've talked about that. The Harper government, it might be eroding Canadian values, but then we said, well, what are Canadian values? There doesn't seem to be a history or a story. Like the Americans can hang everything on this sort of story, for better or for worse, but there doesn't seem to be this Canadian story that represents, that every Canadian knows. Every American knows the story of the American dream, and they can hang their hats on that. But with Canadians, there doesn't seem to be sort of a common set of Canadian values. Would you agree with that, or?
Well, I can see the criticism, and I also worried that people want to create a set of values. Adolf Hitler tried to do that in Germany, you recall, and so did Joseph Stalin. And as far as mass murder goes, Stalin hits Hitler easily, and Mao Zedong does it even better. So I'm not sure people who want to create universal or national values are my cup of tea. They rather worry me off. But I think we did have a record, because of our relative prosperity and its growth during war years, of being international, of trying to establish values that we would live with.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of these work very well. I mean, I've had classes that really condemned multiculturalism, and they were very diverse culturally as groups, as individuals. But multiculturalism is at least a better idea than the one we used to have, which is that we're all white racists as the only superior beings around. An idea which we may have inherited from the British Empire, but certainly didn't fit our facts. So I think we were on a better heading when we were trying to be decent citizens of the world. I think we made some progress in that direction. And if I have any dismaying feelings about the present government, other than its relations with Quebec, it's their relations with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Don't forget, they're taking those ideas from the people you just mentioned. I recognize all the United States. American values in the world have not been exactly glorious here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, can we really defend what they did in Iraq or Afghanistan?
Yeah.
If we only look at the consequences. They're pretty awful.
Yeah. Any other questions for Dr. Morton, or should we let him go?
Well, back, Joe.
Well, thank you, sir. I really appreciate your time, and we all appreciate your time. I know that you're busy, and it's nice to connect with somebody who's been at this institution before. So we really appreciate and really value the time that we've had with you.
Well, thanks very much. I've enjoyed this experience too. First time I've been spiked into a classroom, I think maybe it won't be the last. Anyway, good to meet you, and I hope you have a good year.
Thank you very much, sir. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.